Good morning. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second session here at Donor Doom. I would like to introduce Dr. Alicia Hayes. Dr. Hayes is an educator, researcher, and developer focused on emerging technologies such as virtual reality, mixed reality, and the Internet of Things, IoT, as well as gaming and gamification. She's passionate about implementing, developing, and ensuring effective, engaging, and usable educational technologies that simultaneously encourage critical thinking and respect of diverse learners and learning styles. And who doesn't need that in this day and age? She has worked on large-scale educational projects sponsored by National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Today, she will present a talk titled Immersive Technology. Will it connect or isolate us? Please take a moment to silence all of your electronic devices, but do feel free to tweet using the hashtag DonorDoom. Thank you and enjoy. Dr. Hayes.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, let's get going. No, I'm just kidding, we're not there yet. Yeah, today we're going to talk about immersive technology. Will it connect us or isolate us? And I was going to start with my answer, and then I thought it might be a little bit more interesting if you heard the arguments and maybe decide it for yourself. But although I did get a great introduction, I guess I don't really have to say too much about myself. I'll do a teeny bit of an introduction and let you know that my research is held in a lab called SURGE. It used to be at Purdue and Fort Wayne, and now it's at University of North Texas. The things I look at are simulation, user research, game experience, and immersive technology. And specifically, I'm focusing on how people can learn with emerging technology. So if, for instance, tomorrow they decided the VR was a horrible thing and threw it away, I would just pick the next thing, like go back to research on my smartwatch and figure out ways that we could use whatever technology it is that is engaging to people for learning purposes. So some of the projects that I've worked on that I wanted to highlight, an ROTC simulator where lots of ROT simulators exist, but the most notable thing about this is that we used a locomotion kind of, well, they call it a VR treadmill, but that's kind of a misnomer because it's not really a treadmill. It's called, the name of the product is WizDish, and it's basically a dish that you walk in and it can hear your movement and it moves you forward in virtual space. But this is better than what we have if we're talking about creating immersive and realistic experiences, because generally we can move around in a space the size of whatever room we're in if we have room scale tracking, or we can teleport, which isn't the same if you're trying to train troops about troop movements if they're teleporting, because of course you don't do that in the real world. And also using the Microsoft HoloLens, you can see that's me using the HoloLens and then one of our clients. One thing that's interesting about this, I am probably a harsh critic, maybe one of the harshest critics of emerging technology. I hate it when people use things that you don't need to use for something that you could use something much simpler. So after we created this project for the customer using the Microsoft HoloLens, we scrapped it and made something easier, which was using just a tablet-based augmented reality, because what they wanted to do was show their product to customers. And not only are customers not having a HoloLens, it's just a lot of excessive technology for a really small thing that you could do easily. So we want to use emerging technology, but it's scary and we don't know how to do it. And maybe dawn or doom, maybe it's going to, we're all going to die. They're all going to laugh at you. So I found this a couple of years ago, and I use it all the time because I think this is hilarious. Because when I was little, my mom used to say this to me: don't sit so close to the TV, you're going to go blind. And I do have to wear glasses, so maybe she's right, except for now, I strap a television screen that's high resolution to my face. And I haven't gotten any worse vision. It's been the same for the last 10 years. So maybe that was a fallacy. But I really want you to think of technology as a tool, not technology as something that can hurt us or technology as something that can make us better. Technology is something that we can use for good or ill. And you hear this all the time during Dawn or Doom, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I will say the other thing about this, kind of like the example of creating a project in the HoloLens and then switching back to a tablet, development is iterative. So you might see something that's absolutely amazing, and then you will find that really it wasn't that amazing, but it was just novel. Have you ever had that where you got something? I think I've heard many stories of people getting VR, like the PlayStation VR, and they have it for a couple of weeks, and they're like, this is the coolest thing ever. And then they stop playing games on the PlayStation VR, and they never take it out again. Like our library at University of North Texas said students, when the first few months we had it, in there all the time, just in lines for it. And then they just stopped coming. So why is this? I mean, this technology has been desperately sought after since before the first iterations of VR. If you look at 1962, Helix Sensorama, or 1968 Sutherland's sort of Damocles, which looks kind of like a torture device. So we wanted so badly to experience new realities that we were willing to put something like that on. Which, funny story about the Sword of Damocles, the reason Sutherland says he named it that is because if it fell on you, you'd die. So I wanted to use a metaphor that we are really familiar with. We've had lots of talks about this session of the cell phone, right? So early iterations, you look back at this, early iterations of VR, early iterations just with two-way radios. And then we went to a time most of you guys were not alive yet. Just a few years before I was alive, the cell phone was invented, 73. Of course, it wasn't released for commercial adoption until 1983. And you can see, imagine in 1983 something that cost $600. Like, I probably should have looked up the rate of inflation. But I'm guessing it's pretty equivalent to what we pay now for a smartphone that's as powerful as a NASA computer was back then. So you can see that there's this evolution, and that was just a 35-year evolution from two-way radios to cell phones that were giant bricks to today where we have all kinds of smartphones that can do everything 80 years later. So we're nowhere near that 80 years from 1962 and 1968. We're more like 30 years, 40 years, wait, there we go, 50 years. I was like, I did the math and now it's not in my head. But in 2012, most of you who are familiar with VR probably know that Palmer Luckey was the founder of Oculus, and the really big buzz that came around Oculus was that Facebook decided to buy it. And this is significant for reasons related to this talk, because remember what we're asking is, will immersive technology connect us or isolate us? Well, maybe a foreshadowing element to this question would be the fact that one of the largest social media companies, the largest social media company in the world decided it was worth billions of dollars to purchase this IP. So in 2012, I want to point out another couple of things. Between 2012 and 2016, Palmer Luckey launched this Kickstarter to start Oculus. At the same time, New York Times Google released Google Cardboard. Google and the New York Times decided this was a thing that everyone should have. So in the New York Times, they released tons of these Google Cardboards that were branded, of course, for New York Times. And the idea was that we could create virtual journalism experiences and maybe transform media. So already, it just got in the ears of consumers that we were going to start thinking about VR again. And already, we have New York Times branding. And then as soon as Oculus, there's a very long story about this, but as soon as Oculus got support for this, then other companies started to get on board. So then we had the Htc Vive, which is made by the company Valve that has Steam, if any of you are gamers. Basically the largest video game distribution platform. Now, 3 years later, so not even 2 years later, we go from the very basic intro equipment to VR, which allows you to do things like with the Samsung Gear, drop your phone into and experience virtual experiences, to room scale VR, where you can have base stations set up and it can track your movement in a particular space, or even the Oculus, where you can have kind of seated tracking at this time. In 3 years, we go from that to the Oculus Quest has been announced. Oculus Quest is going to be a standalone VR system that is supposed to be competitive with what we used to need, a $1,500 computer and a $500 headset. Now that's going to sell for $599, I think. $5.99? I'm pretty sure it's $5.99. But it will have the 6 degrees of freedom tracking, and you'll be able to walk around with it. One of the biggest limitations, as you can see with this other visual, is that high-end virtual reality requires many wires to connect it to computers. So we've come up with these virtual reality backpacks, which sounds really great until you try to use a VR backpack. And I'll get into this idea. One of the biggest limitations for adoption of VR and whether or not we can make it isolating or connecting, first we have to have it in our houses as part of our daily lives. So one of the biggest limitations was this kind of tethered experience. And now companies, very quickly, because they don't want it to die on the vine, are coming out with ways that we can have untethered experiences. Similarly, the Vive has the Vive Pro, which is a wireless experience. And also, before the Vive Pro came out, they were selling Vive adapters. And TPcast was a company that created the Vive adapter so that you could use the Vive and have it remotely connected to a desktop computer, which still is limiting because that means you can't use it just anywhere. You have to be near your desktop computer. Oh, and the last one, and maybe the most noteworthy, because one of the things we'll keep talking about, of course, in this talk is social VR. What are the limitations that exist if you're trying to connect with a person? I'll give you a clue, and this is audience participation. What was the limitation when I was trying to connect with you when I had a VR headset on? Absolutely, eye contact. So one of the maybe game changers will be the Vive, which has eye tracking in it, and there are some other companies, I won't even call them, they're more like startups, pre-startup companies that are trying to make ways to use eye tracking and virtual reality. So just a teeny bit more on the background of VR before we get into the use cases. So obviously, I think everyone has heard of Pokemon Go, right? So Pokemon Go. So I bring this up for this reason. And if you've been in my talk before, I'm pretty sure that I say this to every group I ever introduce VR concepts to. Milgram came up with this idea in 1994 of a virtuality continuum. So this was before we had mass adoption of VR or even commercial VR available. But he wanted to look at, and it's an important thing to look at, the relationship between reality and virtual reality and all of the things that go in between that. So this whole central area, mixed reality, the term is used so frequently in so many different ways, much like the term virtual reality, that I think this graphic is much easier to understand. So some people may call something like a cave a mixed reality, and other people will call a cave, that's the environment that this guy at UC Davis is in, they might call that virtual reality. But from the sense that Milgram had, I would call that mixed reality because he's physically interacting with physical objects in the world. And the last one, this example here, which is another good example of a use of VR that actually engages your senses. From Full Sail University, that's Rob Cato and his Parasailing VR. What you maybe can tell in this picture is that to create the sense of parasailing, remember VR removes your sense of what you can see around you, and it removes your hearing of what you can hear around you and replaces it with virtual sounds and virtual sights. But we have 5 senses. So he's trying to address that because he has someone sitting in a parasailing seat and he has the wind blowing against them, so you kind of have this sense of fully being in a different space. And then I just included that because it's an Egyptian in a VR headset, and that's just cool. So levels of interaction. We care about this because we care about this a lot, actually. And most people who are VR purists, or as I call myself, a VR snob, care about it because right now, most people who think they've tried VR have tried 360-degree video. So if you've tried 360-degree video, to me, it's a step up from having used a ViewMaster. And there's nothing wrong with ViewMasters. I like ViewMasters. I'm also a fan of 360 video. Some 360 video is very engaging, and it just like other cinema. But it's not the same as what we originally were considering as virtual reality. Then you look at something like interactive virtual environments like World of Warcraft or any number of 3D environments that you don't necessarily immerse yourself with a VR headset. You can move around on a 2D screen, but they're 3D spaces. People have been calling these places, like Second Life, virtual reality forever. So when you do research on virtual reality, it's kind of hard to distinguish which things are what you as a purist would call VR and what the masses are calling VR. I personally think maybe we need a new term, but that's another talk, maybe next year. And the other, the highly immersive is kind of the interaction of all of these things. So level of interaction, it's highly immersive, so this is the name of the game. Someone tell me the name of this game. Has no one played this? Yeah. There might be a game called Flow that looks like this, but basically, I don't know how that name has just poofed out of my head. But basically, this is a game that you can create art in 3D space, and then they can save your creation, not just so someone can enter your space and experience the art that you created, but someone could enter the space and experience it as you created it. So I could stand here where some genius 3D artist created like a rendering of some model from Overwatch or something like that, and to stand here and watch the drawing happen all around me, which I think is a really cool, immersive way of experiencing art. But this is about the level of interaction, but we're still not at a place where we talk about isolation or connection. We're almost there. Before we can talk about isolation or connection, again, we have to talk about whether or not people are even going to have VR headsets, because who cares if it will isolate us or connect us if nobody uses it? It's like, that's great. But here's a study of VR adoption that was published in Forbes this year about people responding to how frequently they use their virtual reality. And kind of like I mentioned before, it doesn't have what they call stickiness. Like people buy it and then they kind of get bored with it and they move on. I have many friends who made a room in their house for VR because they were so excited about it, and then within a year that room became like a junk room or something. I don't know if any of you are at that place yet. But the awareness and familiarity with VR has been increasing, which is what we want. And many companies are spending a lot of money to try to make this happen. But still, as I mentioned before, Steam, it's hard to get data on who's actually using their VR except for these kind of simple surveys. Steam, however, did publish this year on how many people were using different headsets that were connected to Steam. Of course, not everyone who uses virtual reality is connected to Steam, so this is just a small sample. But for Steam, one of the most interesting things of this is that even though Steam creates the Vive, more people were using an Oculus through Steam than they were using a Vive, probably because the cost of the Vive was much higher. Of course, all of these things are going to become less expensive. That's the goal of the entire industry. And this is the part where we transition into the answer to the question. Why is VR not being adopted? Why are people getting it and then getting bored with it? Well, like this study says from Forbes also, VR needs more social interaction. 77% of the people that they polled said they like VR, but they need more social interaction. And then Palmer Luckey, who is the inventor of the Oculus Rift and the founder of Oculus, he wrote a blog post just, a couple of weeks ago. Free isn't cheap enough. So basically, he's saying, even if we gave away VR, right now there's not enough good stuff for us to think that it would have any mass level of adoption. And he goes on to say, we need more social also. So if we need more social in VR, what does that mean, and what does it look like? Well, that's where we get to this talk. So connection, that would be what we're talking about when we're talking about being social. Connection, by definition, is your interaction with other people. And we measure this in different ways, and this has been since long before we were considering consumer versions of VR. In the 90s, we came up with these measures that we would see how effective virtual experiences were. Because before we had these consumer versions that you see, I maybe should have shown you this, there were $500,000 and $50,000 VR headsets that research labs and military labs would use. and how we measured whether or not a VR was successful. Presence, so that's whether you feel like you're there. Co-presence, whether you feel like you're there with someone else. Oh, finally, we're getting to what we came to talk about. Whether you feel like you're there with someone else. So right now, I am co-present with you, and you're co-present with me. And then there's social presence. Social presence is that sense of connection between people in a space. Specifically in this VR research area, it's social connection between people in a virtual space. However, I want to use the metaphor outside of the virtual world and say, I am co-present with everyone in here. And I hope to be socially present with at least half of you. I hope at least half of you are engaged and feeling connected, and if I look at you, you're looking at me, and I can make eye contact with you, that sort of thing. Why does it matter if we have social connection in VR? Who cares? Well, first of all, we care because if you're one of the people who thinks that VR is a transformative technology and that you want people to have it in their homes and their schools, for, as I do, small purposes, I don't really want VR to take over every media. I want people to be able to use VR when it's appropriate. But if people don't have VR, I can't even deliver to them VR experiences. We want people to be connected because we live in a world where people are frequently complaining about being isolated. We've even heard that in some of our talks where people are separated even though they're together, and they're tweeting all the time and getting all of these likes but have not any real friends and not any true connections. So the idea of this connection through VR, in theory, could mean that people could have more meaningful connections and that you could have connections, maybe, if you're like me. I have many colleagues. I also have many friends. Most of my friends don't live anywhere near me. I also live in Texas, and my family lives in Indiana. So I could be co-present and socially present with the people around me, but I'd much rather be co-present and socially present with the people that I like, that I play games with on Twitch, or people that I know in Indiana that I love and miss, or I could have small talk and chit-chat with people at work. So when we talk about connection, this is a thing that could be afforded with virtual reality technology. Then the opposite of this, social isolation. So are we going to be isolating ourselves from society when we're using VR technology? Obviously, there's some level of isolation with the way the technology is right now, right? I can't, even most VR experiences are single person experiences right now. And I really can't fully experience another person the way the technology is right now. Like you mentioned, we can't even have eye contact with the way that the technology is right now. We can have fake eye contact, but it's not the same, and we know that. So why do we not want to be isolated? Well, I guess that's kind of an obvious answer. We're humans, and humans are social creatures. And also I should go on to say, humans also experience actual physical problems from isolation. But I wanted to point out a difference between isolation and solitude, because there's kind of a paradox between these ideas of connection and isolation. Maybe not so much isolation, but the solitude level, where people who are very connected also need, especially if you're not an extrovert, also need a sense of solitude. And even people who are extroverts, there has been a lot of research on the fact that things like meditation and deconnecting help people who are overloaded and bogged down with their excessive need to connect. So we have all of these people who connect all the time on Twitter and Facebook, but yet we have increasing levels of social anxiety. So here's one way that we use virtual reality for connection. There are virtual reality trainings that help people to deal with their sense of social anxiety. And the way that we do this is by slowly introducing people to experiences that induce social anxiety. So the easiest one might be a telephone call. And you, instead of having an actual experience, you can recreate this one technology that you make and then deliver it to 100,000 people with social anxiety disorder, where they experience maybe going to the store. Because some people who have social anxiety don't even like to go to the store, don't like to answer the phone, things that people who don't have social anxiety take for granted. And then they slowly do this thing that they call systematic desensitization and increase the level of anxiety that they're exposing you to, so that you eventually start to feel more empowered. And then we have social skills VR trainers. So here's one. We have VR trainers that train people on workplace, train people on interviews, train people how to be better teachers. And my favorite, probably because I feel like this might be a sign that we're going towards possible mass adoption or that Walmart just likes to blow money. Walmart just did a training with 100,000 of their employees in VR to teach them about social interaction with customers. Specifically, the training that I read about and listened to some webinars on was to teach them about Black Friday. Because apparently the turnover at Walmart is so great that a lot of their employees that will be there on Black Friday were not there last year on Black Friday, so they don't actually have many people with this experience. And it's kind of a big deal for this day to go well because it's the biggest sales day of the year. So they decided that this would be a good way to train their employees on an experience that is rare and not really easily duplicable. So we can teach people about things that are social, and that's nice. But does it matter? Because we can teach people these things anyway. So then we get to things that maybe are a little bit harder to teach. And this is actually Jeremy Bailenson, who does a lot of research at the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, has done a great deal of research on how we can immerse people in training experiences. And he focuses on the fact that we don't want to put people in VR all the time. He says we should put people in VR for experiences that are rare, experiences that are impossible to duplicate, experiences that are dangerous, and experiences that expose you to new things. So here's a police training. And I'm sure everyone has been hearing all of the kind of civil unrest and things with police lately and people's dissatisfaction with police de-escalation and things like that. Well, here are some examples of police training where they have firearms training simulator, this police training for de-escalation, so teaching police what the process should be to de-escalate someone before they engage with force. And then this picture is about empathy. And the reason why it's a picture like this and not a picture of a simulator is because while there are some simulators that claim to be able to teach police empathy, this is a tricky area. So in simulation, we have this idea that we call negative training. Does anyone know what that is? Negative training?
Do you think it's going to work in a very specific way, but it won't actually always apply in the real world?
Oh, that's very close. I like that. So you said you think things will work in a specific way and it doesn't apply in the real world, and it's almost exactly that. But it's that you train someone that things will work in a specific way, and it doesn't work that way in the real world. So if I train you over and over again that this kind of person is going to act this way when you interact with them, and then you go into the real world prepared, ready, smart, I'm ready to go. And then the person that you have been trained over and over again will act a certain way, does not behave in that way. Now you don't know what to do. And you have, instead of this kind of natural curiosity and humility, you have this kind of feeling like you already know it, so it's very hard to solve problems when you think you already know the solution and you're wrong. So a really good example of why we need to think about this is Victoria Groom, also at the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, did a study with Jeremy Bailenson where, again, I should step back. Some years ago, Chris Milk gave a talk where he said VR would be the ultimate empathy machine. Raise your hand if you've heard this talk. No one? Huh. Okay, so in this talk, he basically says, virtual reality allows us to immerse ourselves in experiences we can take on the body of someone else. I can put on a VR headset, look at myself in a mirror, and no longer be a black woman. I could be a Thai little girl, or a police officer, or you, if you're a white man, could put on a black female body. The idea that we have, of course, is empathy, is that sense of being able to feel with someone else. So it's a no-brainer, right? And this is what kind of Chris Milk's argument was. If we can give other people the experiences of the other, they will gain empathy. This is largely true. But the other thing that Victoria Groom found, her findings confirmed this at some level. The other thing that she found, if you're biased against a group of people and you put on their body, it makes you more biased against them. which is a dangerous, dangerous thing. And I wanted to point this out and spend a couple minutes on it because all of you are potential VR content creators in the future. And it's very easy to create something that seems like it works. And I want you to think of that term, negative training. It's very easy to make something that seems like people are learning from it. And if you're not careful, you might not be teaching them what you think you're teaching them. And depending on what you ask them, because most of the time, part of my work is in evaluating how effective technology is, most of the time people come up with very simple ways of analyzing whether or not what they're doing is effective. They'll give a survey. What did you think? Did you learn something? Do you feel like you're going to be better at your job? Awesome, I succeeded. Well, these people who maybe decided that they hated certain groups of people even more after being in this simulation that was supposed to create empathy, they would probably rate the experience positively, but you still would have failed to do what you intended to do. So it's very important that we think about the impact and how we measure the impact of the systems that we create. So this is this is the company that Chris Milk started. It has been funded at something like $40 million. So a lot of people are behind this. As you see, this technology is available everywhere Find VR is served. So it's this idea, and back to this idea, will VR connect us or separate us? Well, I'm seeing this trend, right? There's a trend that VR can help us connect in the real world. And I like that trend, but can it help us connect in the virtual world? Well, so we have many different platforms that are emerging. There was a platform called AltSpace VR. Did anyone use that before? No? Well, it went out of business, so it doesn't matter. I was just curious. But now we have VR chat. Who knows if it'll make it? Other platforms, obviously Facebook VR is probably not going anywhere anytime soon. And then here's another example. There are many examples of companies that are basically pouring tons of money into the idea that people will want to engage face-to-face with people in virtual spaces. This company, Rumi, I work with them sometimes, and the thing I like about this company is that they allow you to be in VR, and also you could be just in the virtual space on a flat screen monitor, which, again, like I said, I'm a VR critic. I also, frankly, don't like wearing VR headsets. I'm going to be honest. You may have noticed how quickly I took this off. So we have these experiences where people can embody themselves in all kinds of fanciful ways, or you can represent yourself as yourself in a workplace, or you can have some kind of transformed interaction just where you're not interacting on a screen but as a 3D avatar. I frankly would never do this. It doesn't seem at all engaging or fun to me. But obviously there are tens of thousands of people who are engaging in Facebook VR, so I'm curious, how many people, if you had a VR headset, would do that? Huh, not many. Some people are like small, raising their hand like, I might, but it's my secret. It's okay. I mean, maybe if I didn't have kids, I wouldn't mind it, but the idea of me not being able to see what's around me is actually anxiety-provoking to me. So aside from the fun, then there's this idea of immersive collaboration. So this is an example. I actually have less time than I thought that I would, so I'm not going to play the video. But this is an example from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, where they have many different trackers all around the room, and multiple people, all of the people walking around are walking around in VR. Well, not all of them, because they also have spotters, because they're walking around in virtual space and they're supposed to be doing a firefighter training simulation. But this guy in the red shirt is supposed to make sure they don't run into each other. So we're still, like I said, well, I guess I haven't actually said this. I've heard some theorists say that we're at the brick phone stage of VR, and I tend to agree. So that's kind of where I got this metaphor at the beginning to show you how far we've come with phones. We still have a long way to go with VR, but it's pretty exciting still. So immersive collaborative play. So this is cool too. The idea that you could play with someone who's completely across the world from you. This is a video from a VR arcade, or this is Beat Saber, a game that a lot of people are playing right now. And you can have competitions with friends. Basically, again, like you're in an arcade, but not actually be with them. Funny story that's kind of tangentially related to VR. My daughter is 13, and when I woke up on Saturday morning, she was playing Minecraft, and she had her best friend on speakerphone, and they were in the same world together. So that's maybe the immersive virtual kind of thing, but not a VR experience. But I'm not sure if the next iteration of kids who play like that won't be kids who do the same thing, but in VR. However, maybe they also won't want to have a VR headset on. Then we have immersive technology in school. This is the thing I care most about. This is the thing. This is one of my daughters, so obviously I care most about. We were doing VR demos at schools for a summer project. But then this is a video from Google Expeditions. So Google Expeditions, basically Google is putting a lot of money into trying to get content out there for VR for education. The interesting thing I think about Google Expeditions is that everything in Google Expeditions is a 360 video, which again, as a purist, I'm like, well, you're kind of getting kids into VR, but it's not really VR. But it's better than nothing. But as you can see, these kids seem really engaged. Again, though, since we talked about the stickiness of VR, we're going to need to do longitudinal studies on whether or not kids are engaged with this in a way that makes them continue learning this way, or if they're just engaged because it's new. And even if that's the case, even if they're engaged because it's novel, that's good, but that would create a different learning direction than if it was something that we were going to use and integrate as our full curriculum. And then the one on the right is Merge VR, and the thing that's cool about them is that they also, this would be definitely mixed reality. They have a little block that you buy with the Merge VR kit, and if you can see, they're actually using a cell phone, but it can see, it's a see-through experience, so it's augmented reality, but really mixed reality, because it overlays virtual objects on that cube, as you can see with the demo. So depending on what the lesson is, the kid can be holding a heart or a skull or any number of things. So we're right there. We can live in the matrix. We're not really there. But what if we could? Is this a thing that we would want to do? I ask this question because the question is, will virtual and immersive experiences connect us or isolate us? If they isolate us, but we like it, is that a problem? If we have immersive solitary play and this idea of escapism where we escape into another world and we avoid our own life problems, it is. It is a problem. It is a problem if we isolate ourselves with VR. It's a problem because some of the examples, adult content. So this book by Peter Rubin, I highly recommend it. Future Presence talks about virtual reality changing human connection, intimacy, and other limits on ordinary life. One of the most interesting parts of this book, and I actually confess I got the audiobook, but one of the most interesting parts of this book, from the whole discussion of intimacy between friends and lovers, he gets to the point of talking about adult content. And much like our keynote yesterday, when I asked him, does it matter if we're having technology change our society? Because technology has always changed our society. And his response was, it's happening exponentially faster now in a way that maybe gets out of control. So our cell phone usage has gotten to a point where we're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was going to be using this much. This was not the plan. Similarly, when you talk about things like the adult content and virtual experiences, for instance, he's saying people who think that, oh, yeah, some people watch porn and it's not addictive, but then they find these more compelling experiences where they're having social interaction, and then people are becoming more likely to be addicted to things that they weren't likely to be addicted to in the past. He actually has a case study where he's talking to a man who's been married for years and he's not into porn, and then all of a sudden he gets a VR headset and it's just like, oh, maybe I'll just check this out. And then next thing you know, he's telling his wife 3 months later that he's like all engaged in all of these websites, and according to the book, things went well and they de-escalated, but who knows? Similarly, games that can be more immersive, and gambling, social interaction. And I put social interaction here because of the point that I made before. That idea that if I could be immersed in a virtual space and be connected with the people that I like across the world, what's to stop me from stopping talking to my colleagues at all? And not talking to my partner anymore, and barely talking to my kids, It's like, oh, well, there's these 20 people that I really like in the world, and I'm just going to be connected to them all the time. So when connection isn't positive, this VR chat and other things, we can use this for social interaction positively, but it can also be used for bullying. But inversely, solitude is not always negative. So we have these examples like VR meditation, or, and I think we'll end here because we need to have time for questions, this idea when you can't see outside of the headset. So when you're in a VR headset, one of the limitations is also a benefit. When I put on a VR headset, it is the only time that I cannot multitask. Seriously, I multitask all the time. When I drive to work, I listen to audiobooks. You know, like when I make dinner, I'm listening to music and dancing and talking to my kids and like all of these different things. When I'm in VR, that's all I can do. It's also probably why I don't like it that much. So maybe this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are arguing that augmented reality is going to be the face of this emerging technology of being immersed and interacting with virtual space. When you can't see outside of the headset, it's dangerous in some ways for your connection with the people around you. But imagine a world in which you could get someone's undivided attention for 20 minutes. That's such a premium these days. I imagine that everyone in here can think of a person that you wish you could get them to pay complete attention to you for 20 minutes. I can think of almost everyone I love. So this idea of can virtual reality and immersive experiences connect us or isolate us? My answer, of course, is yes. They can connect us. They can isolate us. We get to decide how we use the technology. We get to decide if this room is a room full of people who are in a connected experience or if they're just people who are co-present and socially disconnected. So back to the idea of what Heilig and Sutherland were thinking about in the 60s, we are now at a place where we can start doing these things. We can actually create visual sensations and or stimulus and auditory stimulus. We even have people doing research on visual taste and smell technologies for multisensory internet. That's a whole book. People are doing really interesting immersive technology research where I'm not sure I want to be a participant in this research until it's vetted, but using electrical currents to create senses of taste. Don't think there's anything I want to taste badly enough that I'm going to let you put electricity on me until some other people try it. But it's interesting that this is around the corner. There are technologies for haptics where you can touch things in the virtual space. My ideal, if virtual reality were used to connect us, then I could live in Texas and not have to wait until only twice a year to visit my family, but visit them on their birthday and be like, haptic hug and feel it, and they could feel it, and we could share eye contact. Obviously, the technology we have right now is not there, but like I said, we're in the brick phone stage. So as these things emerge, we have different technologies we don't even understand yet. This Ultra Haptics device, and this is where I will close, this Ultra Haptics device is a device that uses ultrasound to create a sense of touch. When you're in VR, the very interesting thing about this is if I have a VR headset on and it shows me an object that I'm touching, and then it sends the sensation that I'm touching this object, I can feel it, which makes sense. What doesn't make sense, and they did not expect, when I turn my hand over and the ultrasonic waves are touching the bottom of my hand, my brain tells me that the thing is still in the palm of my hand. So there are things that we don't even understand, brain science things that are happening. We're trying to define them after the fact. So will VR or immersive technology connect us or divide us or isolate us? The answer is yes, but you are the architects and you get to choose. Every person of every discipline has something to contribute to this field. Remember, we're trying to recreate the world in a virtual space. That's something that everyone can and should be a part of. And I'll take questions.
We have about 1 or 2 minutes for questions, so I'll, if anybody has a quick question for Dr. Hayes.
I answered them all.
You clearly did.
I was interested to see that ViewMaster.
Oh.
Yes, so could you just say a little bit about how that was like, one of the earliest times, or,
Oh yeah, for
you
sure.
would look in there and you were someplace else, you were in the Grand Canyon or something.
Well, so the idea of the ViewMaster was like this idea of understanding how our stereoscopic vision works, which is basically the head fake that we use for VR altogether. You're tricking your brain into thinking that something is in front of you because we understand the way, if you do that thing where you close one eye and the other eye, the image is slightly different. So if you present images in front of people's eyes in ways that they would appear if that object were in front of them, then it tricks their brain into that sense of depth. That's what we do with VR. That's what we do with 360 video. So yeah, to me, it's just like the next step beyond that. And I mean, if I had more time, I'd talk about the history of this idea of virtual experiences, because some people argue that this is as old as cave drawings, and that people who drew cave drawings were trying to create a sense of depth and demonstrate that stereoscopic vision like they understood it even, well, as long ago as people drew in caves. Yesterday.
Yeah, there was just something eerie about being a little kid and looking in there. Yeah. And when I saw that, I thought of that feeling.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, so big hand for Dr. Hayes, and hopefully it sends you off thinking about all of the considerations in virtual reality. Thank you.